Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you to Compliance Into the Weeds, a podcast where, with Matt Kelly, the coolest guy in compliance, founder and editor of Radical Compliance, we take a deep dive into the weeds of a compliance or compliance-related topic. Compliance Into the Weeds is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network and now on C-Suite Radio. We also now have our own iTunes show, so check us out. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back with Matt Kelly for a special live recording of Compliance Into the Weeds. We are at Converge 19 this week, and we are sitting down in Denver to record this podcast. I should alert you now, put the children to bed because Matt is coming in hot. We are going to take a look at the Quad Graphics FCPA settlement from last year. Matt came out with an early blast, I think it was on Monday, of his indictment of the enforcement action, but he's actually become more incensed since that time. So, Matt, you want to tell us about this case, and then we can explore why it's so egregious.
Well, I'll do my best, but Tom, I got to admit, there's so many twists and turns and whole separate silos of misconduct here that we might need a flow chart or backup to make sure we got it all. But the facts, of course, were that Quad Graphics, which does printing and marketing stuff, and your firm may have used them for color coding or color printing a presentation from time to time. They paid $10 million to settle FCPA charges in their Peruvian subsidiary, their China subsidiary. Their Peruvian subsidiary not only bribed foreign government officials in Peru to win contracts, but then tried to bribe judges to fix a tax case which didn't work, and they still lost the case until it got appealed to the Supreme Court, and then finally they won. And the Peruvian people also were somehow involved in exporting goods and services to Cuba in violation of the U.S. trade embargo. My whole post just focused on bribing government officials in Peru. I never even got to trying to fix a tax case. I never got to China. I never got to Cuba. And you go on, and I'm like, holy hell. Like, this case reads like a Jean Le Carré novel, and I barely know where to begin. But almost every basic FCPA compliance error you could make, in my opinion, they made. It looks like there was some real malfeasance by fairly senior U.S. executives who were basically told by the Peruvians, we're doing this, should we do it? And my favorite was when they were Peruvian executives were paying invoices to subsidiary to make it look like they're basically paying the bribe through a third party. We've seen that before. Told the U.S. executives they were doing this, is it a problem? And the U.S. executives said, don't send us any more of the suspicious invoices, we'll look into it. And then they never got back to them. And there seems to be the willful intent here, up and down, left and right, and I was really shocked to see that the SEC took these actions, but the Justice Department has declined to prosecute, which really leaves me scratching my head about how did you reach that conclusion. But like I said, we could go for an hour just on what the facts are before we even get into lessons learned. So I don't know where to start.
So as I recall from your blog post, one of the key points that you raised was that the company seemed to get credit for, if not self-disclosure, stopping the bribery about 4 years after they found out about it, and moving forward from there. And I think that was highlighted that the company had known about the bribery because executives from Peru were asking, should we continue to pay the bribes some 3 or 4 years prior to this 2016 date. So that certainly seemed to be an anomaly. The actual knowledge of U.S. executives clearly, seemed to me to be clear from the SEC enforcement action as well. I was a little puzzled by the Cuba component because I had really thought under this administration that would be punished more seriously. Not that it wasn't taken seriously, but perhaps punished more seriously.
So I'll start with the supposedly prompt disclosure that the Justice Department credited Quad Graphics as part of why they declined to prosecute. So here's what actually happened, and I have to pull back up the notes to make sure we get all of this right because it's so bizarre. But by 2013, as these bribe payments were happening from Quad Peru to government officials, the finance director in Latin America took his concerns about these payments to the U.S. finance director, like the global finance director for the whole company up in the United States. This was in 2013. He said, we're making these payments. Should we keep doing it? This looks a little fishy. And the U.S. director replied, do not send me these fishy invoices. I will look into this in 2013. And there was no follow-up. 2 years pass. A new Latin America finance person comes in who does have the horse sense to say that these bribes are bribes, we shouldn't be doing this. He goes back to the U.S. corporate executive suite, tells the same U.S. executive 2 years ago who said, don't send me the bribe payments, the invoices, I'll look into it, and then never looked into it. The same U.S. guy now in 2015 says, oh, well, let's look into this. He finally consults with legal, they self-disclose to the government, and here we are. And yet somehow the Justice Department now says, well, that was prompt self-disclosure. How is it prompt disclosure when you sat on this knowing it for 2 years? You specifically said, don't send me any more of these invoices. And then when a second person comes back to the same executive with new complaints, then they decide to report. Like, that's not prompt. That's knowing for 2 years that you had a big mess and putting your fingers in your ears and hoping it would go away. Maybe there is some secret collection of facts that have not been disclosed. That would be nice to know, but all the Justice Department says in its declination letter is they get credit for prompt disclosure and remediation and all this other stuff. Look, that's not prompt. So why did they say it was? I mean, I am seriously wondering if this is just a cut and paste error from somebody in the DOJ offices who didn't delete the word prompt before they churned out this declination letter that they published. It makes no sense.
So what about the bribery schemes did you find particularly offensive?
Ooh, let's see. I especially liked that the bribes were funneled through 4 sham vendors, 3 of which had the same physical address in Peru, and all 4 were owned by the same person. And yet somehow the due diligence that Quad Graphics may or may not have been performing, and I will go on a limb and say I think it's probably on the may not have been performing, but the due diligence glided right past what would be a basic red flag, a huge red flag. 4 different vendors right in the same place, owned by the same company, and the payments went on through. I also liked that, I suppose in an abstract sense, I really got a kick out of the bribes that were paid through Quad Peru's law firm to try to fix the tax case with the judges who were looking to make a $12 million judgment against Quad Peru, which apparently would have been a big deal. It would have been 2 years' worth of profits for Quad Peru, up in smoke in a tax penalty. I can see the incentive to resolve that expeditiously, but come on, folks. And I understand that this is a developing nation. Peru is not known for its clean government. There's going to be a lot of difficulty there, but working with a law firm to fix a tax case, like, at what point did somebody, somewhere, anywhere think this was okay? This should not have been okay at all. I'm going to guess minimal training, no training. Like, did their training not mention that funneling bribes through your law firm, through your vendors was a problem? If they had great training and people were ignoring it, then that's the lousy internal controls, which is what the SEC ultimately dinged them on. And like I said, I haven't even gotten to Cuba. I haven't gotten to China. I don't even know enough about those parts of the cases really to talk about them. But this case literally has something for everybody. Every compliance mistake you could make, I think, is in this settlement.
So I really enjoyed the bribes of the judges part, because let me just read some of the numbers that the law firm, Peruvian law firm, not only was an active part, but suggested the bribe amounts. So for the first bribe at the trial level, it was going to come in at $20,000. Then they won at the trial level, but they got it reversed at the Court of Appeals. So about 6 months later, the law firm said they needed $50,000, obviously trying to bribe more judges.
Well, appellate judges cost more. Come on.
Exactly. 3 months later, apparently the $50,000 didn't work. 3 months later, they billed at another $200,000, and then 2 days after that, they billed another $400,000. So we're getting into some fairly serious bribe money here. Interestingly, the payment could not be made out of the law department's funds. They did not have funds for that type of payment. So the payments were made out of an account used to pay suppliers. So that's a clear disconnect between accounts payable in terms of ramping up these funds or invoices, payment out of not a suspicious account but another anomalous account to hide the payment. So really interesting.
I mean, on a serious note, that does violate several good principles of third-party governance. They're all listed in the FCPA guidance the Justice Department put out. You know, are you paying a third party through the account for which it had been created? You know, law firms should be paid through the legal department funds. Are you paying a third party for services which it can supposedly provide? And if you're funneling money through a supplier account to a law firm, that should be a red flag. And of course, they couldn't even supply the service, which was a fixed case, which just makes it all the worse. My favorite number in this whole thing, though, was that the monthly retainer for the law firm was $1,200 a month. Now, I get that it's an emerging market, but I'm doing the math. Here in the U.S., $1,200 might buy you 90 minutes worth of a partner's time. And there they are thinking $1,200 for the whole firm for a month. Like, I hate to say it, but that was, even, I think, by Peruvian standards, probably too low. So why would you have it? Why would anybody not ask? Are the prices commensurate with the services being performed? Which is another hallmark of the FCPA guidance on third parties. And, like, it didn't happen.
So I thought there were a lot of lessons learned from the nuts and bolts compliance perspective. We've talked about the third parties, the sham third parties, the sham invoices. Actually, we didn't mention the invoices because the invoices were classic. Remember, you had 3 third parties from the same physical location, and then you had 4 third parties, one more, with all the same owner. Well, they would come in with the same descriptions for the same services, billed at the same amounts, sometimes with the same invoice numbers, and that never got picked up. So we had failures in due diligence. We had failures in invoicing review. We detailed the failures of review around the law firm billing. But it started out really, Quad Graphics had no appreciation of how to deal with an overseas expansion because they had no compliance program in place. And they acquired by merger an internationally focused company. And so prior to 2010, it was a private company, printing company headquartered in Wisconsin with domestic sales only. After their purchase of World Color Press, Canadian company, they were a major international presence. They had no compliance program. Their first hire as a CCO actually had no compliance experience and no tech experience. So maybe they're the ones who contributed to the need for compliance expertise in the compliance function.
You know, that is an excellent point, and I had wanted to raise it too, is that we can't lose sight of the forest through the trees here. Now, there's a lot of trees we can pick over, but the forest is that this was an organization, Quad Graphics, that picked up a large publicly traded firm in this kooky sort of reverse merger thing. Then suddenly they become a big global player, and clearly the board had no idea of the implications of that around what their compliance risks would be, how you would try to govern those risks. They were totally out of their depth. I was struck by that because so often when I write about the nuts and bolts Sarbanes-Oxley compliance issues, pre-IPO companies, they spend forever trying to figure out how to survive that transition. And they actually spend more money just before the IPO and just after the IPO on all of this stuff. And I don't know enough of the history around this specific transaction, but it kind of looks like Quad Graphics just quickly did a merger and whoa, here we are, we're a public company. And like, that's not the way you do it. Because if you do, you wind up with these situations much later, and this is just an enormously expensive way to learn your lesson about how to conduct yourself as a public company, and they should have been able to anticipate that.
Perhaps the other thing we might spend a few minutes on was the total amount of the fine and penalty. The company agreed to pay $6.9 million in disgorgement, $959,000 in prejudgment interest, and a $2 million civil penalty on top of that. Damages, monetary relief nearly in the amount of $10 million. That actually seems relatively low for the conduct involved.
I think so. And I mean, this is a company that these days is about $4.3 billion a year in revenue. Back when the misconduct happened, it was closer to $4.7 billion. Like, they can afford more than $10 million. I know it's nobody's idea of a good time, but there was willful intent here, or I don't know, actual knowledge or negligence, or however you want to, whatever you want to call it. But it's not like people were clueless as about what misconduct was happening, and then they did not move to rectify it in a timely manner. And some of the details of, duplicate invoice numbers and duplicate vendors, and these processes or accounts payable are still paying out the payments. Like, that's just sloppy accounting, and it is sad that this is a relatively low fine for that sort of misconduct. And let alone the Justice Department and no criminal misconduct, where would the personal indictments then be? Are there any forthcoming? I haven't seen any like that. But if we are in favor of letting companies go as they help us pursue individuals, okay, but if there is ever a case that raises questions about who's going to get nailed on this, somebody should get nailed on this.
I guess the thing that struck me the most was when I read the summaries of this case, and I read the SEC press release, I thought this is going to be a fairly standard case, nothing really new. But frankly, there was a lot in here to digest. Lots of lessons learned, lots of policy issues, lots of almost philosophical issues of the points around FCPA enforcement on a forward-looking and backward-looking perspective.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a great case.
Well, Matt, this has been a ton of fun, and I look forward to seeing what next week brings us.
All right. Thank you, Tom.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. If you have any questions, you can email Matt at mkelly@radicalcompliance.com. You can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. I hope you'll join us again next week where Matt and I take another deep dive into a compliance or compliance-related topic. Compliance Into the Weeds is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network, now a part of C-Suite Radio, and once again, we have our own iTunes show. So get the iTunes Compliance Into the Weeds app so you can check us out every week on a regular basis. Thanks so much for listening, and I look forward to visiting with you again.